Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In today's video, I am joined by Michael Lofton to talk about the Magisterium. Michael, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing great. Michael, for the audience, could you tell them more about yourself and about where they can find out your resources online?
Yeah, so I'm a convert to the Catholic faith, and I am an apologist. So I talk about theology all day long on YouTube, and I started a channel, Reason and Theology, about 3.5 years or so ago. And yeah, like I said, it's on YouTube. So that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Oh, and yeah, and Michael also works for Catholic Answers, and he's got a bunch of great videos. You just did a live stream with Capturing Christianity, and I watched it. I thought it was excellent. So today's topic is the Magisterium, which is a specialty of yours, Michael. So this video isn't really a defense of the Magisterium vis-a-vis Protestant objections. Really,
Right.
I want to talk about this for Catholics, to inform Catholics. So I'll just kick it off by asking you a basic question, which is, what are the various organs of the Magisterium?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. This is the stuff that I'm passionate about talking about the most because I actually found it to be incredibly relevant to not only just apologetics in general, but also my personal journey in discerning Protestantism, Catholicism,
Mm,
or Eastern Orthodoxy, especially. So when we speak of organs of the Magisterium, I mean, and that is the term that I prefer, we can really reduce it to two organs, the Pope and the College of Bishops. Now, when we speak of the College of Bishops, we're speaking about the bishops in the world collectively in union with the Pope, not separate from the Pope. So there is no College of Bishops apart from the Pope. The Pope is part of the College of Bishops. He's actually the head of the College of Bishops. But then we can again also consider the Pope distinctly as an individual. And those are two distinct organs. So we could speak of the Pope acting individually as an organ, as a teaching
mhm,
authority in the Catholic Church. But then we can again also speak of the bishops collectively as the College of Bishops in union with the Pope, speaking collectively. And we can do so in the case of, for example, an ecumenical council. We would speak of that as more kind of its extraordinary form.
mm,
But we can also speak of the College of Bishops when they act outside of an ecumenical council. The bishops in union with the Holy Father, with the Pope, but dispersed throughout the world, so outside of an ecumenical council. Um, we would call that the Ordinarian Universal Magisterium. That's still an organ of the magisterium, but it falls within the College of Bishops. So really, there's just two distinct organs there. But then again, it can take shape in various ways, and it can exercise its authority in different ways. So we
mm.
can speak about that if you're interested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, is this what you mean? So, the difference between local and universal would be, for example, the difference
Ah.
between an
Mm.
ecumenical council and then a diocese, a bishop of a diocese?
Okay, so now when we're speaking about, um, uh, yeah, so when I spoke of the organs there, I was speaking specifically of the universal aspect. So we're
I
talking
see.
about the Pope teaching as the universal shepherd, definitively or non-definitively. And then when I
Hmm.
spoke of the College of Bishops and an ecumenical council, that's still a universal act of the magisterium in its in that
Mm.
organ. And even whenever you have the ordinary and universal magisterium, it's still acting as a universal organ. But then you bring up a good point. What about whenever the magisterium is not acting universally? What about a local bishop, or just something that's reduced from an ecumenical council, perhaps a local council, a regional
Mm.
council, like a provincial council? Um, what about things like the Conference of Bishops and National Conference of Bishops?
Mm.
We can speak of those as the magisterium locally.
I see.
um, but very technically, when we speak of it locally, it's no longer the College of Bishops. The College of
I see.
Bishops pertains to the universal church, acting as a universal organ. um, so when we speak of these lower levels of the magisterium, I it's kind of hard. How do we classify that, right? Do we classify that as a separate organ of the magisterium? You know,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a debate there, but certainly we could speak of the magisterium acting in a local capacity, such as you mentioned, a bishop in a diocese, or perhaps just a local council. Now, in those cases, whenever you have I will say a member of the magisterium rather than the organ here.
I
When you
see.
have a member of the magisterium, such as a bishop, teaching in a local diocese, that's always going to be non-definitive, and it only pertains to his diocese.
Gotcha.
Mhm. Yeah, I could say much more along those lines, but yeah, take it wherever you want to go.
Okay, yeah. So, real quick, just for me and for the audience, what's the difference between ordinary and extraordinary? Because I hear you
Mm.
often use those terms. What's the difference?
Yeah, and they tend to be incredibly misunderstood. So
Mm,
in some cases, I do avoid them, but I did use those terms earlier because sometimes they're
mm,
appropriate, but they're often used in, I think, ways that are misleading. So I tend to avoid them in certain contexts. But you
okay,
ask a good question, because the magisterium itself uses this distinction between ordinary and extraordinary in certain circumstances. So they are legitimate terms, but I just do want to add the caveat that they could be very easily misunderstood because there's a lot of distinctions here. So when we speak of extraordinary and ordinary, let's
hmm
just think of it like this. Um, it kind of means what it sounds like. Let's speak of the Pope. Let's just speak of the Pope, that
okay,
organ of the magisterium. Okay, the Pope can teach in his extraordinary magisterium or his ordinary magisterium, and it means what exactly it sounds like. When the Pope teaches in his extraordinary magisterium, it's extraordinary. It's not common. When he teaches in his ordinary magisterium, it's more common. So as long as we're understanding those terms in that way, that's appropriate. We can also speak of the College of Bishops teaching in an extraordinary way in an ecumenical council, because ecumenical councils aren't that common. There's only been 21 of them in 2,000 years.
yeah,
It's much more common for the College of Bishops to speak in what's called the ordinary and universal magisterium. And that is whenever they're dispersed throughout the world and they're consistently and constantly teaching something as definitive. That doesn't take place in an ecumenical council. It's just kind of a day-to-day thing that's consistently done throughout the ages. So that's more its ordinary form. So in those senses, the distinction between extraordinary and ordinary is appropriate if we're using them in that context.
I see.
But sometimes I fear that we use those terms in ways that are misleading and misunderstood.
Like it
Um,
requires less assent or something like that.
Perhaps I've seen them used in all kinds of ways, but as long as
Gotcha.
we're limiting those terms to those contexts, I think we're fine. Um, where I've seen people misuse those terms
hmm
is they'll think extraordinary means infallible and ordinary means non-infallible. That's when I have a problem, because that's not
I
true.
see.
Because you could have the ordinary magisterium teaching infallibly, if you will, or definitively. It's known as the ordinary and universal magisterium, at least whenever it's speaking in a definitive way. That's also infallible, but we call it ordinary.
hmm
So that confusion, the very common confusion of extraordinary means infallible, ordinary means non-infallible, it doesn't hold up when you really look into the magisterium. It's certainly the case that because there are instances where the church is in its extraordinary form, like an ecumenical council, but it's not teaching infallibly. Such as an ecumenical council like the Second Vatican Council. There are instances where
hmm
it doesn't teach infallibly, but it's extraordinary magisterium because it's an ecumenical council. So
I
it's
see.
not always the case that extraordinary means infallible, but it could mean that. It's not always the case that ordinary magisterium means non-infallible, but it could mean that. So in those cases, what I prefer to say is definitive versus non-definitive. I prefer
Okay.
those terms rather than extraordinary and ordinary.
Okay, so it seems like there's a difference between what is taught, is it definitive or non-definitive, versus who is teaching. So,
Oh
from
yeah.
what yeah, so
Hmm.
from what I can gather from what you said so far, basically there's two main organs, which is the Pope and then the College of Bishops in union
Yeah.
with the Pope.
Yeah.
There's the universal teaching of those organs is basically when the Pope teaches to the church or when bishops teach to the church. But a local instance might be several bishops gathering together not with the Pope, not as an
Mhm.
ecumenical council, and making some decisions. And then
Mhm.
ordinary would just be the regular teaching that happens on a day-to-day basis, but
Mhm.
extraordinary is like an ecumenical council or an ex cathedra declaration or proclamation. Is
Yeah.
that a fair summary?
I think that sums it up. And also, when we speak of the Pope, we can speak of him teaching non-universally. We can speak of him just teaching locally as just the Bishop of Rome in his diocese. So
I see.
there's that
Okay.
too. So in that organ, there's also this kind of universal versus local capacity as well.
I see.
Um, but yeah, you bring up a good point, because we're now making distinctions between the magisterium considered as subject and the magisterium considered as act.
I
We can
see.
speak of the magisterium considered as subject, act, and object, those three distinctions. So the organs pertains to the subject, who is teaching. The magisterium considered as act is how is it teaching, infallibly, non-infallibly.
Mm,
The object of the magisterium is what is being taught, right?
mm,
Primary object, secondary object, things like that. So what is being taught? And so
gotcha.
you can consider the magisterium in those three distinctions.
Yeah, well, that's actually a perfect segue into my next question, which is about the profession of faith, the first, second, and third paragraph. Could you maybe explain what this profession of faith is and what these paragraphs mean?
Yeah, this is what got me interested in the magisterium, was the John Paul II's profession of faith that you're referring to here, and in particular a commentary on it by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Now it's known as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, but back then it was known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It released a commentary on this profession of faith by John Paul II. And I remember reading that commentary when I was at Christendom, and that released when the bug bit me, and I got really interested in the magisterium. And to this day, I still reread that document constantly, because I get more out of it every time I read it. But yeah, as to your question, the profession of faith, John Paul II, I think it was 89, somewhere around there, released his profession of faith, that has, as you mentioned, three paragraphs. Really what it is it starts out with the Nicene Creed, or the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed that we say at Mass. So it starts out with that. You profess the Nicene Creed, and then after that you have three additional paragraphs that you're to profess. And the first paragraph is about, in fact, I can pull it up here in a little bit, but the first paragraph is about those things that are dogmatic. So you're maintaining everything that the church teaches dogmatically. So it doesn't list every dogma, but it just says
Mm,
I affirm these things, and you're affirming them with divine and Catholic faith. So you affirm with divine Catholic faith those things that are dogmatically taught by the church. And what is dogma? What is the first paragraph teaching specifically? These are things that God has revealed, but that the church and that the church has also definitively taught as revealed by God. And you'll notice I said definitive rather than solemn, and we can get into that distinction
mm,
later. But they're definitively taught by the church. So a dogma proper is not only something that God reveals in Revelation, sacred
mhm.
scripture, but the church is also confirming it as something that God has revealed. So it's not just my opinion, but it's confirmed
Gotcha.
by the church. So those are dogmas. So you make a profession of faith with those. You give divine and Catholic faith, because God reveals it, Catholic faith because the church has confirmed it.
Gotcha.
And then you have what's called second paragraph teachings, which you make a profession in adhering to with it actually uses a language of to be held definitively. You definitively hold to those teachings that they're not necessarily revealed by God, but they are historically and logically related to something revealed by God. So that if you were to deny one of those, you would then indirectly have to deny something revealed by God. So they're technically not revealed by God, but they're so intimately and necessarily bound to them logically or historically that if you deny one, you would actually end up denying something that God revealed. So, for example, that the Council of Nicaea is an ecumenical council and is definitively binding in its definitive
Mm,
propositions. That is a secondary object of infallibility, because God has nowhere said the Council of Nicaea is
Right.
true. I mean, when did God ever say that in Scripture? He never revealed that. But is now Nicaea up for grabs? Can you really now say I don't accept Nicaea as an ecumenical council? Is that what we're going to say? No, because if you were to say that, you would most likely end up saying that I don't accept Jesus as consubstantial with the Father, which is something that is revealed by God. At least the substance of that proposition is. So you see how that's historically related, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe something that's logically related. Scripture and God has revealed that Jesus is fully divine and fully human. Well, reason tells me one aspect of being human is risibility, the ability to laugh. So if someone were to say Jesus didn't have the ability to laugh,
Mm-hmm.
are they denying any dogmas? Technically, no. But if you were to say that, what are you indirectly saying? You're indirectly saying he's not fully human. So in an indirect way, you're denying a dogma. But did God ever say Jesus laughed? No, he never said that. But you can't say Jesus could not have laughed because you're now saying that he's not fully human, and divine revelation does say that. So that's what we would call a theological conclusion or a virtually revealed truth. And that we would classify as a secondary object because God never revealed that proposition, but it's logically bound to something God has revealed. So you make a profession to adhere to those definitively in the second paragraph. And then lastly, in the third paragraph, you have teachings that you adhere to with religious submission of intellect and will. You assent your intellect willfully to the teaching. And the teaching, however, is non-definitive. So it's not this irreformable teaching. Dogmas are irreformable. That's not going to change. If it's dogmatic, it's not going to change. It's infallibly taught. Second level teachings, those secondary objects of infallibility that we mentioned in second paragraphs, those are also infallibly taught. Those are not going to change. Third paragraph, however, could be reversed. Those are what we would call non-definitive teachings. They're authoritative insofar as it comes from the authentic or the authoritative magisterium that Christ established, but they're not taught in a definitive way that the church could never reevaluate and reverse. So the submission that you give to them is a lower grade than the other submissions. The assent that you're giving, it's a lower grade because it's saying, I accept it because it's a teaching authority that Christ established, but I'm not accepting it as irrevocable. I recognize that the church could reform this.
That makes sense. Okay, let's see if I've understood what you've said. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the first paragraph is, in a nutshell, the creed. But the creed and dogmas of the church, which basically say this is revealed. So it's a definitive declaration. This is revealed, and that requires assent of divine and Catholic faith. Is that right so far?
I would offer some pushback on that because
okay.
So you said the creed there. Well, I would certainly put the creed in the category of divine as attesting to divine revelation. We could speak of them as dogmatic, the articles of the creed, but I just want to make sure that we're not limiting dogmas to the articles of the creed. That's all, because there are some things that could be dogmatic that are not in the articles of the creed, like transubstantiation. That's nowhere in the creed, but that's dogmatic.
Or the Immaculate Conception. Okay.
Or the Immaculate Conception. Or did the Holy Family flee to Egypt? All right, that's nowhere.
I see.
That's not even defined in any of the church councils, but it's in divine revelation. So we would say it's an undefined dogma. It's not defined as a dogma, but it is an undefined dogma because it's in divine revelation.
So undefined and defined dogmas that come from revelation require divine and Catholic faith on our part. And that's paragraph 1.
Yeah, somebody might push back and say, but they don't require Catholic faith because they haven't been divinely, they haven't been confirmed by the church. But you know what? They kind of have, because the church upholds sacred scripture as the divine revelation. So everything that is proposed in them, I would still say requires that Catholic faith to it. So I would say that's appropriate.
Okay, that makes sense. And so paragraph 2 is anything logically related, like to all
logically
of these,
or historically.
Okay, and that requires submission of intellect and will, or also divine and Catholic faith.
Neither. It's a middle category.
Okay.
And the language they use is to be held definitively, if I
To be
recall
held
correctly. Yeah,
definitively.
to be
Okay.
held. So
Okay.
a definitive adhering to. Yeah.
I
So
see.
it's not divine in Catholic. It's not divine because God didn't technically reveal it.
I see.
Um, and it's not Catholic faith because although you can maybe use that term in a qualified sense, but we tend to use
Mhm.
that to say the church has confirmed that this is something divinely revealed. So they rather tend to use the expression to be held definitively.
Okay, that makes sense. And
Mhm,
so both paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 are,
mhm.
definitive,
They're definitive. Right.
teachings. Okay.
Right.
And finally, paragraph 3, so this is for me, sorry if I'm
Yeah,
repeating
yeah.
everything you're saying.
Sure.
Paragraph 3 is anything that the church teaches in her magisterium that,
Mhm.
anything else basically, and it requires
Mhm.
submission of intellect and will. Is that correct?
That's correct. And a good explanation of all this is in the commentary by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Technically, it's a commentary by Bertone and Ratzinger, but it says it's signed
Okay,
by the offices from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But really, it was just their commentary. Um,
gotcha.
in its commentary on the Profession of Faith, I've found it to be wonderful. I don't agree with everything that's in it, and you
Mhm.
actually don't have to because technically it's not an act of the magisterium, but it's
Mm,
a very great commentary by Ratzinger and Bertone. So I think it's well worth reading. You might say I disagree technically with some of the
yeah.
examples that are given or something like that, but on the whole, it's an amazing document, a great commentary.
Awesome. All right. So, and so paragraph 3 are non-definitive. They haven't been defined by the church. And so that's okay. So that's the paragraphs. Now, my next question, Michael, is I often hear this term called the theological notes.
Mm.
I know that could be a whole show, but is there a way you can present to the audience what do we mean when we talk about the theological notes, and what are they in general?
Yeah, the theological notes. And by the way, I see John Salza in the chat. He brings up a really good point about the SSPX rejecting third
Mm,
paragraph teachings. In fact, I think I had him on the show and we were talking about it the other day. So y'all go and check that video out on the channel if you haven't seen it already. It's a really,
mm,
really good interview. And that's a point worth noting. So your question is about the theological notes.
yes.
Yeah. So these were um, this is a phenomenon that really came about. I think the earliest that I've ever seen is the Council of Constance.
Mm,
So it really starts to come around the 1400s, and it was prominently used until the time of the Second Vatican Council. Um, there's no indication that at Vatican II that they would no longer be used, and there are also some post-conciliar um, documents that encourage that we continue to use them. But unfortunately, in practice, we're not using them as much as we should. But I think we should. What exactly are they, however? Well, um, it's a way of grading, if you will, the degree by which perhaps the church has taught something, or how common it is among the theologians, or whether something is pious or impious to say. So it's a pretty wide range of um, notes, if you will, or uh, judgments that we can make about a particular proposition. So we could say, as one of the theological notes, in fact, the highest theological note, we could say this is a dogmatic proposition.
hmm
All the way down to one of the lowest notes, which might be something like offensive to pious ears. We could say
mm,
this proposition, it's not dogmatic, but it's offensive to pious ears. It sounds bad to the faithful and
yeah.
to the
Yeah.
pious. And so you have a whole wide range of grades of certitude and grades that we can offer to judge a particular proposition in between. That's the theological notes. They include not only what am I saying about this proposition positively, but also negatively, meaning
Mm,
I could say this is a dogmatic proposition. That's a kind of a positive declaration. But I could also say, but if you deny that, you're guilty of heresy. That's a kind of more of a negative judgment.
yeah.
Those are also, they fall under the theological notes, but they're specifically called theological censures.
That's what I was
So
going to
if
ask.
we
So,
speak of
yeah.
the theological censures, we're only speaking about the negative judgments. But when we
Gotcha.
speak of the theological notes, we're referring to both the positive or negative judgments.
That makes sense. Yeah. So what I'm understanding here is that theological notes are the degree of weight that the teaching has, and then they come kind of hand in hand with the corresponding censure. So whether it's heresy or just impious to Catholic ears. Does that make sense?
The note, when we speak of the notes, correctly.
Okay. Okay.
Correct. We could be referring to either one of those. Yes.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, great. So this is again for me and for the audience. Oftentimes, I hear people use the term dogma and doctrine interchangeably.
Yeah.
Is that appropriate? And if not, how should we use them?
Yeah. I mean, if we're just speaking just technically, that's not appropriate.
Okay.
But I understand that, when we just kind of in our everyday speech, we tend to use those, we conflate them and use them as synonyms. But very technically, those are distinct. We can actually refer to dogma as the first level teachings, the primary objects of infallibility. Doctrine could refer to second or third level teachings. Depends on
That
what
makes
kind of
sense.
doctrine. So if we speak of a definitive doctrine, that definitive Catholic doctrine, I should say, that would be second level, second paragraph, secondary objects of infallibility. But we could also speak of non-definitive Catholic doctrine, which would be third level teachings, the ones that require religious submission of intellect and will. So even then, whenever we speak of doctrine, what kind of definitive, non-definitive Catholic doctrine? That could be second or third level teachings. And they're certainly, in the technical sense, they're not the first level or primary objects or dogmas. So there's definitely a distinction there when we technically use the terms, but I recognize that in common speech, we tend to conflate them, but I try to avoid that so that we can get as specific as possible, because if we're not specific in some cases, we can really, confuse some people.
No, that's very helpful. Yeah. Okay. So dogma and doctrine, there's a distinction there. Definitive, non-definitive, we saw with the paragraphs. Let's maybe talk about that third paragraph and specifically about reversals. First of all, are reversals possible? And, you said yes. And second of all, have there been reversals in the history of the church?
They're only possible for third level teachings.
Okay.
So I want to make that very, very clear, just in case somebody misunderstands. There is no such thing as a reversal, properly speaking, at least for a primary, secondary object. Maybe we could have a reversal as far as the language which we use, as long as we're maintaining the same proposition, the meaning of the same proposition.
Makes sense.
The meaning of the proposition has remained the same for all primary and secondary objects of infallibility. You might be able to use different language, but that different language has to still communicate the same meaning.
Gotcha.
So if we speak of a reversal there in relation to those, I'm only going to speak of a linguistic reversal that maintains the same meaning, because Vatican I, for example, anathematizes those who would, assert a different meaning to a dogma, for example. But even the Magisterium recognizes you can use different language for dogmas, as long as the meaning is still the same. So you might not use the word transubstantiation to describe the mystery of the real presence, as long as you use some other word that gives the same meaning. But if you're using some other words that gives a different meaning, no, that's a problem. You can't. You're now redefining the truth of the proposition, and that's an issue. But third paragraph teachings, however, we can speak of a conceptual reversal. We can speak of that. Because the church itself recognizes that, the magisterium itself recognizes that, and by the virtue of the fact that it's non-definitive. I mean, it's the very definition of non-definitive. If it's non-definitive, it's just that, not definitive. It can be reversed.
Gotcha.
And so Donum Veritatis has this concept of non-definitive teachings. It doesn't call it that per se, but it speaks of that, if I recall correctly, in some of the later paragraphs. I forget if it's 21 or 24. Also, of course, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that commentary speaks of non-definitive teachings, but that's technically not an act of the Magisterium. Lumen Gentium 25 from the Second Vatican Council implies non-definitive teachings in the Papal Magisterium. Humani Generis also implies them in the Papal Magisterium. So we can certainly observe this phenomenon of non-definitive teachings in the Magisterium itself. So because it's non-definitive, I think I think it was Avery Dulles who argued just the very use of that term admits that you could have a magisterial reversal.
Right.
Now, you asked another question: could or have we ever had a reversal in
Right.
this category? Now, that's where the debate is. Okay, so could we have one? Yes. Have we ever had a reversal of a non-definitive teachings? I am not going to concede that yet.
Okay.
Now, I'm open to it, but I have not yet conceded any instance because I have not
Wow.
seen any necessary evidence to force me to that. I know there are a lot of people who are going to throw out a lot of examples, but I haven't yet seen anything that would necessarily make me concede that. It could be it's out there. I'm just hanging so far as what I've seen in my current understanding. I have not yet conceded that there are any instances. There are some strong arguments, there are some good examples, that there's some good contenders, but I haven't yet conceded it.
That makes sense. Here, I have a comment here, Michael. Dr. Declue says, I would refer to doctrine as the genus and dogma as a species. All dogmas are doctrines, but not all doctrines are dogmas. I think that
Just
was
depends. That's appropriate as long as we're using the term in that way. Doctrine just means teaching, and so there's different. Yeah, you could use it in that way, but that's going to be the non-technical sense.
Gotcha.
In the way that some of the documents of the magisterium are using it, that's not the technical sense. So it just depends on what are we adhering to, just kind of a rigid technical sense or more general sense. That's true, but that's also not true if you were to read and use it in the sense that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and its commentary on the Professio Fidei uses it. So again, it just depends on how we're using it.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so so you made that distinction between a linguistic reversal and an actual reversal. You said an actual reversal is possible by the mere fact that we're calling these teachings non-definitive. But has there actually been one? It's
a conceptual reversal.
A conceptual
I'm
reversal.
specifically referring to third paragraph teachings and conceptual reversals in third paragraph teachings. I don't have a problem saying there have been reversals in language. I don't have a problem with that.
That's hard to deny, I would say.
Yeah, but specifically conceptual, like fully the actual proposition has been, it's fully reversed, the meaning. I haven't conceded that yet for any third paragraph teachings.
Gotcha. Okay, so
and by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I also
You're
have
good.
to throw this one caveat in there because a lot of people misunderstand this. I'm also not referring to disciplines. Obviously, disciplines can be reversed and have been reversed, but I would not label a discipline a third paragraph teaching.
Makes sense.
It's not a teaching; it's a discipline.
That's right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because a discipline isn't a doctrine or a moral. It's not a truth of divine and Catholic faith, nor is it a moral command.
It's like I would see it as the prudential application of something, and so they're certainly related, but they're not strictly identifiable.
Gotcha. Okay, well, so you talked about the magisterium as subject, its acts, and as an object. So subject, act, and object. I want to ask you about infallibility. So, what does it mean? Is the magisterium infallible, and how so in light of that? That's kind of a very broad question, so you can take it wherever you want. But maybe talk to us about infallibility.
Yeah. So very, very technically speaking, infallibility is proper only to God, but then we can speak of in maybe a secondary sense, infallibility applying to the church. And then it only applies to the subject and the act of the magisterium. It does not apply to the object. So we would speak of the Pope as infallible as a organ. We would speak of him infallibly teaching something, but we would not speak of an infallible teaching like an object. In the case of an object of the magisterium, a teaching, we would speak of an irreformable teaching, or we could speak of definitive. Definitive applies both to it could apply to the act, the organ, the subject, or the object. It could refer to all. So I tend to just use the term definitive so that I'm not using it imprecisely. But yeah, technically irreformable applies to the object. Infallibility applies to the subject and the act. And all it means is, it doesn't mean that the magisterium has revealed something new. It just means that it has inerrantly proposed something that has already been revealed by God, or is intimately related to it. So it just means God has protected the truth of the proposition. It's protected God has protected the proposition from error. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that the magisterium has expressed it in the best possible way. No, it doesn't mean that, but it just means it hasn't expressed it in a way that is false. That's all
Yeah.
it means.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
I find that really interesting that you said we don't speak of the object as infallible, but the subject and the act. I find that interesting because there's a sense in which language will always fall short. All it can do is protect the mystery, but itself isn't the mystery. Do you say, is
Yeah.
that fair to say?
That's fair, because we can never exhaust the divine
Right.
mysteries of God. And so we're not saying that infallible acts of the magisterium or irreformable teachings are expressed in the best possible way.
That's very helpful.
Maybe
Yeah.
maybe throughout the ages, with further reflection, we can express it better, or due to changing circumstances and the way we use language, it could be expressed better. So I think you actually have a document commented on by Ronner way back in the day in the 70s, where
Hmm.
I believe it was the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith conceded this in a document. I forget the name of it offhand.
Gotcha.
Well, we got
No,
the
okay.
clue in the chat. He would know
Yeah.
with Ronner. I know he's studied the corpus of Ronner, so he
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
recalls it. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Anything else you want to add about infallibility before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, it also wouldn't apply to anything like disciplines. So there's
Gotcha.
no infallibility operative with when it comes to disciplines. I wouldn't go to the other extreme and just say that you can have disciplines that are destructive to souls, or lead somebody away from Christ in salvation. But I also wouldn't say that disciplines are always the most prudential and the most ideal and the best prudential judgments of the church.
Gotcha. So my next question is very broad, so you're welcome to nuance it away. But the question is, in light of everything that you've just taught us, can the church teach error at all?
Yeah, it's kind of a provocative way of putting it, right?
Yeah.
Not in its first or second paragraph levels or acts, but if we apply the term error to a third paragraph teaching, we would have to say yes, but in a qualified sense, only insofar as the proposition could be erroneous. And here I'm not using it in the way that the Theological Notes uses the term erroneous. The proposition could be not true if it's a third paragraph teaching, which is why it's non-definitive. But just because it could be doesn't mean that it is.
Right.
So if the church has ever reversed any of its non-definitive teachings, it has such a good track record that it's incredibly rare.
Yeah.
Moreover, when we speak of it not being true, it would not be the case that it would be not true to the extent that if I were to assent to it, I would go to hell.
Makes sense.
So I would say that it's safe, right? the not true proposition would be safe to my soul to assent to, but
Right.
it wouldn't lead me away from Christ. But very technically, the proposition wouldn't be true. So if we're using that kind of language, we have to limit it to third paragraph teachings, and even in that case, we still have to speak of a theological safety behind the proposition.
Wonderful. So this actually leads me right into my next question, which is, can the church promulgate a missal or liturgical matters that are harmful to souls?
A missal, not insofar as the issues touch on anything that is vital to the essence of the church, which I think in this case it would. So if you have a discipline that impacts the universal church, and it touches on an aspect that is essential to the church, which would be faith, life, worship, governance, sacraments, stuff like that. If it's vital to those things, the church could not universally impose a discipline that would go against those things, because it would no longer be the church. It would lose one of its essential components. One of its essential components, again, is the transmission of the sacraments and holiness in its worship. And so if it's imposing a missal that is not holy, it seems like it's defected from the faith. It no longer carries out its mission in the world from the time of Christ unto the present. So I would say that the missal might not be the most ideal in all of its liturgical expressions, but it would be at least safe, so that if I were to worship according to that missal, I would not be led astray from God.
Gotcha. And the reason I ask is because this is there are claims out there that the missal, the 1969 missal, is in fact a harm to your Catholic faith. What you're saying is that this is not possible in light of the Church's indefectibility, and to say that would be to incur a theological censor. Is that correct?
So I would certainly say that we could not say that it is harmful to one's soul.
Okay,
But I would say that it might not be the most ideal liturgical expression of the Roman Rite in some
makes sense.
instances. So there is room for improvement possibly,
Hmm.
but it wouldn't be room that, unless it's fixed, my soul is destroyed. When you mentioned theological censors,
Yeah,
yeah, you do have theological censures that apply to um, even disciplinary matters. So some of the minor censures could apply. So you might say that this proposition is, the way this is expressed is ambiguous. You
gotcha.
might say the way this is expressed is rash or something like that. Um, could the church liturgically express something that is ambiguous? Yeah. So
Yeah.
could you actually apply maybe a minor censor to something that is in a missal? I think you could. I'm open to people offering pushback and saying, no, that's not possible, though. But it would
Hmm.
only be a minor censure. It would not be something major.
Gotcha.
Not any of the major censures.
Okay, so and the last, well, two more topics I want to bring up. If you have to go, let me know and we can end. But
I got about 10 more minutes, if that's okay.
10 more minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
the last question for you. Well, two more
Mhm.
is the change of the death penalty, um, is that a reversal? And is it because some are saying this is clear discontinuity and in fact heresy? How would
Mhm.
you respond to that?
When we say reversal, referring to a magisterial reversal or a disciplinary reversal?
The claim is that the claim is that Pope Francis, although maybe he did say, what's the word he used? Inadmissible, does seem to say in his non-magisterial writings that it is contrary to the gospel. Therefore, his position seems to be one of doctrine, you might say, and that it is actually intrinsically evil. How can we respond to this critique that, oh, you guys have changed your doctrine on this aspect, if that makes
Mm.
sense?
Yeah, a lot going on there. So
Yeah.
we could not. I don't think that this qualifies as a magisterial reversal. But I,
Okay.
I would concede that it's a disciplinary reversal if we're going to use the concept and notion of reversals here. That kind of generally.
Gotcha.
Again, I tend to relegate reversals to third paragraph teachings, but I suppose it's proper to speak of a disciplinary reversal. Um, so I would say it's a disciplinary reversal, but not a magisterial reversal, because I don't think that he's teaching either privately or publicly. I don't think he's teaching the death penalty is intrinsically evil. I'm
Gotcha.
certainly not convinced that he's doing so publicly and in his magisterium. If you can maybe find something where he speaks not as the Pope, but in his private person, okay, I'd like to see that, but I haven't seen anything that would necessitate that perspective. But even then, it wouldn't be magisterial. But in his magisterium, I haven't seen any magisterial reversals of the concept of the death penalty, because I haven't seen any language that would make me think that he is teaching that it is intrinsically evil. Um,
Gotcha.
there is a doctrinal development taking place, but the development is to the dignity of the human person. But that development is not necessarily a reversal. So developments can be in continuity. So there is a development to the doctrinal aspects surrounding this, and that is we're more aware of the dignity of the human person. But again, that's not a reversal or a change or a contradiction. Um, on the death penalty itself, I think that this pertains to discipline. Um, are we going to administer it in this day and age?
Mhm.
He seems to think, well, in light of the dignity of the human person in this day and age, since our penal system is such, it's inadmissible. Well, wait, that factual assertion that the penal system is such that can be contested, which would certainly then alter whether or not we're going to apply it or not. So you could offer pushback on whether or not this is a prudent application of the church's understanding of the human dignity of the human person in light of today's penal system. You could certainly offer some pushback there. But I don't think that you could say something like the discipline is harmful to souls, or that the church has changed its teaching here. I don't think either one of those describe the situation with the death penalty. That being said, again, you might disagree with whether or not it's inadmissible today, but you're not doing so based on theological grounds. You're doing so based on prudential grounds.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. So when you add all of the distinctions, it becomes a lot more easier to navigate a lot of these things. So, okay. Well, I think this is a great place to stop. This was a good overview of all the different distinctions, the different levels, different weights. And it was very helpful. This is going to be one of the videos I'm going to return to and take more notes. So I want to thank you for your time, and I want the audience to go check out Michael's YouTube channel, Reason and Theology. Make sure you subscribe to his channel. Watch his great videos on the Magisterium and many other topics, including Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, etc., etc. And so I want to thank everyone for watching this video. Please like, please subscribe, hit that notification bell, comment down below. And if you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/the Logos Project. And so without further ado, Michael, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.